Welcome back to comfy sleeping. Get comfortable now. Let your body sink into the bed. Let your eyes close, even if you keep listening for a while yet. Tonight, we're going to drift out onto the open grassland. The Mongolian steppe, a sea of grass stretching to every horizon at once, and follow the story of the empire that once rose from it. The largest connected land empire in human history, built within a single lifetime by a boy who began with almost nothing at all. We'll move slowly, the way memory moves across a very old story. Unhurried, patient, letting the vast distances speak for themselves. There's no need to remember any of it. Just let it drift past you, soft and wide, like wind across open grass. Picture the steppe at dusk. Grass moving in long, slow waves under a darkening sky. A scatter of round felt tents, jurs glowing faintly from within, horses grazing quietly at the edge of firelight, and beyond it all, nothing but distance in every direction. The horizon so far away it seems to curve with the earth itself. That's where this story begins tonight. Not in a palace, but on open ground, under an enormous sky. Chapter 1, A Hard Beginning. According to the secret history of the Mongols, an account written sometime after his death, blending genuine historical memory with the kind of legend that grows naturally around a founding figure. The boy who would become Genghis Khan was born sometime around 1162. Given the name Temujin, into a minor noble family on the Mongolian steppe. His early life, as the secret history tells it, was marked by hardship rather than privilege. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a child, and his family, stripped of their standing and their followers, was abandoned by their own clan to survive largely on their own, gathering wild roots and small game on the harsh steppe, rather than living with any of the comfort his birth might otherwise have suggested. His mother, Holan, is remembered in the secret history as a figure of remarkable resilience and practical wisdom during this difficult period, holding her small, abandoned family together through what must have been genuinely desperate circumstances, foraging for wild fruit, roots, and small game across the harsh steppe seasons. The text credits her directly with instilling in her children the discipline and resourcefulness that would later prove essential to Temujin's survival and eventual rise. This period of genuine hardship, whatever its exact details, seems to have shaped Temujin's later approach to power in lasting ways. Having experienced abandonment by his own kin firsthand, he would later build his authority less on inherited noble bloodline, which had already failed his own family once, and more on personal loyalty earned directly, a distinction that would matter enormously as his ambitions grew. The secret history also records a formative, troubling episode from Temujin's youth. A violent conflict with his own older half-brother over hunting spoils, ending, according to the account, with Temujin and a full brother killing him. an act his own mother reportedly condemned harshly, comparing her sons unfavorably to wild animals that at least know better than to turn on their own kind. Whether entirely factual or shaped by later storytelling, the episode was preserved deliberately, suggesting it was considered meaningful to understanding the man Temujin became. As a young man, Temujin also endured capture and enslavement by a rival clan, escaping, according to tradition, with the help of a sympathetic captor's family, an experience that reportedly left him with a lasting personal loyalty toward those who had helped him, and a matching, lasting wariness toward those who had once held him captive. Early, formative lessons in exactly the kind of loyalty and betrayal that would define his entire later rise to power. Chapter 2: The Fractured Steppe. To understand what Temujin eventually built, it helps to understand the world he was born into. Mongolia in the 12th century was home to numerous nomadic tribes and confederations, including Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, and others, frequently at war with one another over pasture, livestock, and old grievances, with no single power capable of uniting the steppe for any length of time. Life on the steppe demanded genuine skill from nearly everyone, regardless of status. Children learned to ride and shoot from an extremely young age, since survival itself, let alone warfare, depended on mastery of the horse in this vast, exposed landscape, where a rider's mobility could mean the difference between finding the next season's pasture and starvation. This fractured, competitive world, harsh as it was, also meant that any leader who could genuinely unite even a portion of these rival tribes would command a fighting force, unlike anything the settled civilizations surrounding the steppe, in China, Persia, and beyond, had ever had to face in quite this combined, mobile form. Steppe life also demanded a level of self-sufficiency and endurance that shaped Mongol culture deeply. Families moved seasonally with their herds of horses, sheep, goats, and camels, following pasture rather than settling permanently in one place. A lifestyle that produced expert riders and archers, almost as a simple byproduct of ordinary daily survival, rather than specialized military training alone. Diplomacy between steppe tribes was governed by its own complex customs of alliance, marriage ties, and blood oaths, often sealed through a formal bond of sworn brotherhood called anda, a relationship considered, at least in principle, even stronger than blood kinship itself. Temujin himself formed such a bond in his youth with a young man named Jamaka, a friendship that would later curdle into one of his most significant and personally painful rivalries, as both men's separate ambitions for leadership of the steppe grew increasingly incompatible. Chapter 3: Building Loyalty from Nothing. Temujin's rise began slowly, through a combination of personal alliances, demonstrated courage, and a reputation for rewarding loyalty generously regardless of a follower's birth or background. He formed a crucial early alliance with Togrul, Khan of the powerful Karaite Confederation and a former ally of his father's, using that relationship as a foundation to gradually rebuild his own standing. One of Temujin's most significant and lasting innovations was his willingness to promote based on demonstrated ability and loyalty rather than noble birth alone, elevating capable commanders from modest backgrounds into positions of real trust and authority. A meritocratic approach that ran directly against the more rigid, blood-based hierarchies common among the steppe's traditional tribal aristocracy. This approach earned him something rarer and more durable than fear: genuine, deep loyalty from followers who understood that their own advancement depended on Temujin's success and their own demonstrated service to him, not on which family they happened to be born into. A bond that would prove remarkably resilient across decades of warfare and hardship. Among Temujin's most trusted commanders were men who had once fought fiercely against him. Jib, whose name reportedly means arrow or weapon, had shot Temujin's own horse out from under him in an earlier battle while serving a rival faction. Yet when brought before Temujin afterward and asked to explain himself, answered with such blunt honesty that Temujin, impressed rather than angered, recruited him directly into his own service, where Jib went on to become one of his most brilliant and trusted generals. This willingness to forgive and even elevate former enemies who demonstrated genuine skill and honesty, rather than executing them purely out of vengeance, became a recurring, deliberate pattern throughout Temujin's rise, steadily building an inner circle of remarkably capable commanders bound to him by demonstrated mutual respect, rather than by birth, fear, or coercion alone. Chapter 4: Uniting the Mongol Tribes. Through a long series of alliances, betrayals, and hard-fought campaigns across the final decades of the 12th century, Temujin gradually defeated or absorbed rival tribes and confederations across the Mongolian steppe, including, eventually, his former ally Togrul himself, once their interests diverged sharply enough to end in open conflict. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, gathering the leaders of the now largely unified Mongol and allied tribes, Temujin was formally proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title whose exact meaning remains debated among scholars, but which was understood at the time to mean something like universal or oceanic ruler, a leader over not just one tribe, but the whole of the United Steppe peoples. This unification alone would have been a remarkable achievement in steppe history, uniting a famously fractious, competitive population under a single leadership structure for the first time in generations. But for Genghis Khan, it proved to be only the foundation for something far larger still to come. At this same Kurultai, Genghis Khan also formalized a written legal code for his new united nation, known as the Yasa, covering matters from military discipline to criminal law to religious tolerance, though the original text itself hasn't survived directly, and modern historians must reconstruct its contents from later references and descriptions in other historical sources. The code reportedly imposed severe, often harsh punishments for offenses that threatened group survival and cohesion on the unforgiving steppe, including theft of livestock and desertion in battle, while also establishing protections that were, in some respects, notably progressive for the era, including provisions for religious freedom and the safety of foreign envoys and merchants, protections that would prove essential to the trade-friendly empire Genghis Khan's successors eventually built. Chapter 5: The Mongol War Machine. What made the newly united Mongol forces so devastatingly effective wasn't simply raw numbers, which were often smaller than the settled armies they eventually faced, but a combination of mobility, discipline, and organization refined specifically for steppe warfare over generations. Now unified under a single command structure for the first time. Mongol warriors, trained from childhood in mounted archery, could fire arrows accurately while riding at full gallop, using a powerful recurve composite bow that outranged most contemporary weapons. And each warrior typically maintained several remounts, allowing Mongol armies to move at a punishing, sustained pace that most settled enemies simply couldn't match or even reliably predict. Genghis Khan also reorganized his forces around a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, deliberately breaking up old tribal loyalties by mixing warriors from different backgrounds into the same units, reinforcing loyalty to the unit and to Genghis Khan personally rather than to any single tribal identity that might otherwise compete with his own authority. Chapter 6: The Bow, the Horse, and Mongol Childhood. Nearly every advantage the Mongol military eventually demonstrated on distant battlefields traced back to ordinary childhood experiences on the steppe. Skills built up gradually over years, rather than trained specifically for war. Mongol children reportedly learned to ride, according to numerous historical accounts, almost as soon as they could walk, often strapped to a saddle before they could stand unassisted, and were expected to help manage the family's herds from a very young age, developing an intuitive, deeply practiced relationship with horses that most settled society soldiers, trained as adults, could never fully replicate. The Mongol composite bow itself represented a genuine feat of craftsmanship, built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, and left to cure for as long as a year before final assembly, producing a weapon with tremendous power relative to its compact size, well suited to being fired accurately from horseback, a task requiring considerably more skill and core strength than firing a similar weapon while standing still on solid ground. Mongol hunting drives, called nurj, organized as large-scale, coordinated seasonal hunts across enormous stretches of open steppe, doubled as genuine military training exercises, teaching participants coordinated movement, communication across long distances using signal flags and riders, and disciplined patience, waiting for a coordinated signal before closing in on driven game, skills that translated directly, and quite deliberately, into coordinated battlefield tactics. Once Temujin began unifying these same hunting parties into an actual standing army. Chapter 7: Conquering the Jin Dynasty. With the Mongolian steppe unified, Genghis Khan turned his attention toward the wealthy, settled civilizations bordering the steppe, beginning with the Western Xia Kingdom, and then, more significantly, the powerful Jin Dynasty ruling northern China. A campaign beginning in 1211. The Jin Dynasty commanded far larger armies and much greater material wealth than the Mongols. Along with fortified cities, the Mongols initially had little experience besieging effectively. But Mongol forces adapted quickly, learning siege techniques, incorporating captured Chinese engineers and their technology, and exploiting internal Jin political divisions to grind down resistance over more than 2 decades of sustained campaigning. This campaign against the Jin revealed a pattern that would repeat across nearly every major Mongol conquest to follow. An initial disadvantage in siege warfare and unfamiliar terrain, followed by remarkably fast adaptation, incorporating new tactics and technology from each defeated or absorbed civilization into an already formidable, flexible war machine. Chapter 8: Subutai, the quiet genius behind the conquests. Behind many of the Mongol Empire's most remarkable military achievements stood a commander whose name is far less familiar today than Genghis Khan's own. Despite a case, many military historians consider one of the most successful command careers in recorded history. Subutai, born into a family of blacksmiths rather than steppe nobility, rose through the ranks entirely on demonstrated ability, becoming one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals and eventually commanding campaigns across an extraordinary geographic range, from northern China to the Caucasus Mountains, to deep into Hungary and Poland, over a military career spanning more than 4 decades. Military historians studying Subutai's campaigns have noted tactical and strategic sophistication that wouldn't be widely matched in Western military thinking for centuries afterward, including coordinated movement of separate armies across enormous distances, timed to converge at a single decisive point, extensive and systematic use of intelligence gathering, and a genuine willingness to adapt tactics rapidly based on a specific enemy's particular strengths and weaknesses, rather than applying one fixed approach universally. Subutai's relative obscurity in popular Western historical memory, compared to Genghis Khan himself, likely reflects both the West's general unfamiliarity with Mongol history more broadly, and the simple fact that Subutai, unlike Genghis Khan, never sought or held supreme political authority himself, remaining content throughout his long career as the empire's most effective military instrument rather than its ruler. A career of remarkable achievement that still receives comparatively little popular recognition today, even among many people otherwise familiar with the broader story of Mongol conquest. Chapter 9: The Destruction of Khwarazm. The event that transformed Mongol expansion from a regional campaign into something approaching a world war began, according to most historical accounts, with a serious diplomatic insult. Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarazmian Empire, a powerful Muslim state controlling much of Central Asia and Persia, seeking peaceful trade relations. The governor of a Khwarazmian border city, believing the caravan to be a spying mission, or perhaps simply seeing an opportunity for plunder, had the merchants killed and their goods seized. When Genghis Khan sent official envoys demanding justice and an apology, the Khwarazmian Shah reportedly had at least one of them killed as well, a decision that would prove catastrophic beyond almost any measure for the empire he ruled. Genghis Khan's response was total and devastating. Mongol armies swept through Khwarazmian territory beginning in 1219, destroying major cities including Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, with population losses so severe that some regions of Central Asia, by various historical accounts, took generations to fully recover their pre-invasion population and prosperity. At Bukhara, one of the Islamic world's great centers of learning, Genghis Khan reportedly entered the city's main mosque personally and addressed the terrified population directly, declaring, according to the Persian historian Juwayni, writing decades later, that he was the flail of God sent to punish them for their sins. Whether he actually believed this framing himself, or simply recognized its usefulness in breaking his enemies' will to resist further, remains genuinely debated among historians studying his campaigns. The Khwarazmian Shah himself, Muhammad II, fled westward as his empire collapsed behind him, pursued relentlessly by a dedicated Mongol detachment across hundreds of miles, reportedly dying in poverty and isolation on a small island in the Caspian Sea. Stripped of the vast empire he had ruled only months earlier. A stark, sudden reversal of fortune that ancient and medieval chroniclers on all sides found genuinely remarkable to record. Chapter 10: Gunpowder Travels West. Among the many technologies that moved across Eurasia during the Mongol era, none would eventually prove more consequential to world history than gunpowder. Originally developed in China centuries before Genghis Khan's birth, primarily for fireworks and later early explosive and incendiary weapons. Mongol armies campaigning in China encountered and adopted early Chinese gunpowder weapons, including primitive rockets, fire lances, and explosive projectiles hurled by siege engines, incorporating them alongside more traditional weapons as Mongol forces continued absorbing useful military technology from every civilization they encountered or conquered. As Mongol conquests and the resulting Pax Mongolica connected Chinese, Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and eventually European territories more closely than ever before, knowledge of gunpowder and its military applications traveled west along the same trade and military routes carrying silk, silver, and diplomatic correspondence, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe within roughly a century of the first major Mongol campaigns into China. European gunpowder weapons, once developed and refined over the following centuries, would eventually transform warfare, siegecraft, and global power balances so completely that the entire medieval military world, the Mongols themselves, had once dominated through mounted archery and cavalry mobility would, within a few more centuries, become essentially obsolete. A slow-motion irony in which the Mongol Empire's own vast connective trade networks helped carry forward the very technology that would eventually make Mongol-style steppe warfare itself a relic of an earlier age. Chapter 11: Cities that chose wrong. Mongol siege tactics developed a fearsome, deliberate reputation during this campaign that historians believe was, in part, a calculated psychological strategy. Cities that surrendered peacefully were often, though not always, treated with relative leniency, incorporated into the growing empire, and required only tribute and cooperation. Cities that resisted, however, faced catastrophic consequences intended to make resistance elsewhere appear pointless. The destruction of cities like Urgench involved not just military defeat, but, according to contemporary accounts, the deliberate massacre of much of the population and systematic destruction of infrastructure, including irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture in the region for centuries. This dual strategy, extraordinary destruction for resistance, paired with genuine incorporation and relative tolerance for surrender, proved remarkably effective at breaking the will to resist across an enormous territory. News of what had happened to defiant cities traveled fast along trade routes, and many subsequent cities chose surrender specifically because the alternative had already been made so terrifyingly, publicly clear. Mongol siege capabilities themselves improved dramatically over the course of these campaigns, incorporating captured Chinese and Persian engineers skilled in building and operating trebuchets, battering rams, and other siege engines. The Mongols had little experience within their original steppe warfare tradition. Another clear example of the Mongols' consistent willingness to absorb and deploy the best available technology and expertise from every civilization they encountered, rather than relying solely on their own original methods. Mongol commanders also made extensive, deliberate use of intelligence gathering and psychological warfare, spreading exaggerated rumors of their own numbers and ferocity well ahead of their actual arrival, using captured merchants and travelers as sources of detailed information about a target city's defenses, wealth, and internal political divisions before a single Mongol soldier ever came within sight of its walls. Chapter 12: The Kurultai and Steppe Governance. Central to how Genghis Khan and his successors governed such an enormous, diverse empire was the Kurultai, a great assembly of Mongol nobility, military commanders, and family members, convened for major decisions, including selecting a new great Khan, planning major campaigns, and settling significant disputes within the ruling family. Unlike the strict hereditary succession common in many settled monarchies of the era, Mongol succession theoretically required consensus and formal election at a Kurultai, even though in practice the deceased Khans owned stated preferences and existing power dynamics among his sons and generals heavily influenced, and often effectively predetermined, the actual outcome of these gatherings. These assemblies could take considerable time to organize, requiring senior Mongol princes and commanders to travel back to Mongolia from wherever their own campaigns or governing duties happened to have taken them, sometimes thousands of miles away. A genuine practical constraint that, as covered earlier regarding the withdrawal from Europe following Ojday's death, directly shaped major military and political decisions across the empire's entire history, since senior leaders' required presence at a Kurultai could halt even a highly successful ongoing campaign almost overnight. The Kurultai tradition itself drew on much older steppe customs of collective tribal decision-making that predated Genghis Khan's own unification by centuries, adapted and formalized to govern an empire far larger and more complex than any single steppe tribal confederation had previously needed to manage, blending old nomadic consultative tradition with the practical demands of ruling settled populations across 3 separate continents. Chapter 13: Religious Tolerance in a Brutal Age. Alongside the genuine brutality of Mongol conquest, historians note a policy that seems, at first, strikingly at odds with it. Genghis Khan and his successors generally practiced considerable religious tolerance across their growing empire, exempting clergy of various faiths from taxation, and generally allowing conquered populations to continue practicing their own religions largely undisturbed. This wasn't purely humanitarian in motivation. A policy of religious tolerance made conquered populations easier to govern and less likely to rebel over religious grievances, while also allowing the Mongols to draw administrative and technical talent from Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, and other religious communities across their vast, genuinely multi-ethnic empire without provoking unnecessary religious conflict. The Mongol imperial court itself became a genuinely cosmopolitan place, hosting Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian missionaries, and practitioners of Mongol shamanism side by side, with religious debates reportedly staged for the Khan's own entertainment and intellectual interest. A level of pragmatic religious pluralism relatively unusual for a major world power of this era. European Christian rulers, hoping to find allies against the shared Islamic powers of the Middle East, sent several diplomatic missions eastward to the Mongol court, including the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, whose detailed written account of his journey and time among the Mongols remains one of the most valuable surviving European descriptions of 13th century Mongol society, court life, and religious debate. Genghis Khan's own personal religious practice centered on Mongol shamanism and a reverence for Tengri, the eternal blue sky, understood as a supreme guiding force behind his conquests and legitimacy. He reportedly believed his military successes were themselves evidence of heaven's favor, a conviction that, whatever its ultimate truth, clearly provided real personal and political confidence throughout a lifetime of near constant warfare and highly consequential decision-making. Chapter 14. Karakorum, Capital on the Grass. Before Kublai Khan moved the empire's center of gravity toward China, the Mongol Empire's original capital, Karakorum, stood on the Mongolian steppe itself, a genuinely unusual sight for the era. A substantial, permanent settled city built by and for a people whose entire cultural tradition had, until recently, centered on deliberately not staying anywhere permanently at all. William of Rubruck, visiting during Möngke Khan's reign, described Karakorum in careful detail, including a remarkable silver tree built by a captured French artisan, its branches designed to dispense different alcoholic beverages: wine, fermented mare's milk, rice wine, and mead into vessels below, topped with a mechanical angel that would raise a trumpet to signal drinks were ready. A genuinely elaborate piece of engineering entertainment at the very heart of what outsiders might have expected to be a simple nomadic camp. Karakorum's population was notably cosmopolitan and religiously diverse for its time, housing Buddhist temples, mosques, and Christian churches within a relatively compact area, along with craftsmen, merchants, and captured artisans brought from across the empire's vast conquered territories, each contributing their own skills to a capital that, despite its steppe location, functioned as a genuine, if geographically remote, center of the wider medieval world's trade and diplomacy. Karakorum's importance faded considerably once Kublai Khan shifted his own attention and capital toward China, and the city was largely destroyed by Ming Dynasty forces in the following century, its stones reportedly repurposed to build a nearby Buddhist monastery. Today, only foundations and archaeological remains mark where this brief, strange capital, built by nomads in the middle of the open grassland, once stood at the center of the largest land empire the world had ever seen. Chapter 15. The Pax Mongolica. once Mongol conquest had settled into administered territory. The resulting empire, spanning from Korea to Eastern Europe at its greatest extent, created something historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a period during which trade routes across this enormous connected territory became safer and more heavily traveled than they had been in centuries. The Silk Road, covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on the history of money, as a network of trust and credit spanning vast distances, flourished remarkably under Mongol control, with merchants, missionaries, and travelers, most famously the Venetian Marco Polo, able to cross thousands of miles of Mongol-controlled territory under a single, if often harsh, unified legal and administrative system. This connectivity carried more than silk and spices. Ideas, technologies, and, less happily, diseases moved across Eurasia at a pace and scale not seen before, with some historians linking the Mongol Empire's extensive trade networks directly to the later spread of the Black Death from Central Asia into Europe and the Middle East, a devastating unintended consequence of the very connectivity the Mongol peace had made possible. Merchants operating under Mongol protection carried official documents called Paiza, metal or wooden tablets inscribed with Mongol authority, functioning much like a modern diplomatic passport, granting the bearer safe passage, access to relay stations, and protection from local taxation and harassment across enormous stretches of Mongol-controlled territory. A genuinely early, practical version of standardized international travel documentation, backed by the very real threat of Mongol military force for anyone who violated a bearer's protected status. The Mongols also standardized weights, measures, and in some regions, currency across their territories, reducing the friction and uncertainty that had previously made long-distance trade between different political systems considerably riskier, and more complicated, practical administrative reforms that mattered enormously to ordinary merchants, even if they attract far less popular attention today than the more dramatic military campaigns surrounding them. Chapter 16: The Death of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a continued campaign against the Western Xia kingdom, with the precise cause of death never definitively established by surviving historical sources. Accounts vary between illness, a hunting accident, and other explanations, none confirmed with full certainty by modern historians. In keeping with Mongol tradition, and some accounts suggest his own explicit wishes, Genghis Khan's burial location was kept deliberately secret, with legend claiming that everyone involved in the burial party, and even the river diverted to cover the grave site afterward, was intended to ensure the location could never be found or disturbed. Despite extensive modern searches using satellite imagery and careful archaeological survey, Genghis Khan's tomb has never been definitively located, remaining one of history's most tantalizing unsolved archaeological mysteries. A final, fitting layer of mystery surrounding a man whose early life was already only partially recorded, and often through legend as much as certain fact. One particularly striking modern genetic study, published in the early 2000s, suggested that a specific Y chromosome lineage, unusually widespread across a broad swath of formerly Mongol-ruled territory, may trace back to a single common ancestor living around the right period and region to plausibly be Genghis Khan himself or a close male relative. If the identification holds up to continued scrutiny, it would mean a meaningful percentage of men alive today across Asia carry a direct genetic link to the Mongol conqueror, an extraordinary, almost unbelievable modern echo of his conquests, quite separate from any physical tomb ever being found. Local Mongolian tradition and religious sensitivity have also limited the scope of some potential search efforts near the region traditionally associated with his burial. A mountain area held sacred in Mongolian culture, partly because of its association with Genghis Khan himself, meaning the mystery may remain deliberately, respectfully unsolved for cultural and religious reasons, as much as any purely practical archaeological difficulty. Chapter 17: The Mongol Diet and Daily Steppe Life. Away from the battlefields that dominate most accounts of Mongol history, ordinary daily life on the 13th century steppe followed rhythms shaped almost entirely by the needs of livestock and the seasons, largely unchanged by the enormous political and military transformations happening at the empire's edges. The Mongol diet centered heavily on dairy and meat, drawing on the herds of horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels that steppe families depended on for nearly every aspect of survival. Fermented mare's milk, called arag or kumis, held particular cultural importance, mildly alcoholic and nutritionally significant enough that European visitors like William of Rubruck described it in considerable, sometimes bemused detail in their own written accounts of Mongol hospitality. The jur, the round felt tent still used by nomadic Mongolian herders today, represented a genuinely sophisticated piece of practical engineering, designed to be assembled and disassembled quickly by a small family, insulated effectively against harsh steppe winters, and light enough to transport by cart or pack animal during the frequent seasonal moves steppe life required. Its circular design also carried spiritual significance, with the roof's central opening allowing smoke to escape, while symbolically connecting the household to the sky above. Mongol clothing, too, reflected the practical demands of steppe life and mounted warfare, with the traditional deal, a long wrap front coat still worn in Mongolia today, offering warmth, ease of movement on horseback, and enough internal storage, tucked into a wide belt, to carry small tools, food, or other essentials during a long day of riding, hunting, or campaigning far from any fixed camp. Chapter 18: An Empire Divided Among Sons. Before his death, Genghis Khan divided his enormous empire among his sons and designated successors. a structure intended to maintain unity under a single great Khan, while granting significant regional autonomy to different branches of his family across the empire's vast territory. His third son, Ojde, was designated as the next great Khan, continuing and significantly expanding Mongol conquests deeper into China, Persia, and most dramatically for European history, deep into Russia and Eastern Europe, campaigns that brought Mongol forces further west than they had ever previously ventured. This system of divided but nominally unified rule worked reasonably well for a generation or two. But the seeds of eventual fragmentation were already present in the very structure itself. Different branches of Genghis Khan's family, controlling different regions with different local interests and increasingly different cultural influences, would eventually pull the unified empire apart from within, long before any external enemy managed to seriously threaten it. Genghis Khan's chosen successor process itself reflected real, careful strategic thinking rather than simple favoritism. Rather than automatically favoring his eldest son Jacque, whose paternity was clouded by questions following his mother's earlier captivity by a rival clan, Genghis Khan selected the more diplomatically capable Ojde as Great Khan, while still granting each of his four principal sons substantial territory and command. A careful balancing act intended to preserve both family unity and effective governance across an empire already too vast for any single administrator to manage alone. Ojde, once installed as Great Khan, continued his father's expansionist policies with real energy, while also investing significantly in administrative infrastructure, founding the new capital city of Karakorum on the Mongolian steppe itself, complete with permanent buildings, a printing house, and religious structures for multiple faiths. A deliberate statement that the once purely nomadic Mongols now also commanded genuine, permanent, settled infrastructure to match their military reach. Chapter 19: The Assassins and the Persian Campaign. Before turning fully toward Baghdad, Hulagu Khan's campaign into Persia targeted another formidable power first, one that had spent well over a century using fear and precision violence rather than open battlefield conquest to hold territory and influence far beyond its actual military size. The Nizari Ismailis, known to medieval Europeans, and much of the wider Islamic world simply as the Assassins, a name possibly derived from a claim, likely exaggerated, that its followers used hashish before missions, controlled a network of remote, heavily fortified mountain strongholds across Persia, including their legendary headquarters at Alamut, and had long maintained their considerable political influence through the targeted assassination of rival rulers and officials rather than conventional warfare. Hulagu's forces methodically besieged and captured this network of mountain fortresses beginning in 1256, eventually forcing the surrender of Alamut itself, effectively ending the Nizari Ismaili state as an independent political and military power after more than a century and a half of operation. a Mongol military achievement genuinely difficult for many conventional armies of the era. Given the strongholds famously remote, nearly impregnable mountain locations. This campaign against the assassins, though less famous today than the subsequent fall of Baghdad, mattered enormously to Hulagu's own contemporaries across the region, removing a source of genuine, long-standing political fear and instability that had shaped Persian and wider Islamic politics for generations before the Mongols themselves had ever arrived in the region at all. Chapter 20. The Mongols reach Europe. Under Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, Mongol forces launched a devastating invasion of Russia and Eastern Europe beginning in the late 1230s, defeating Russian principalities, Polish and German forces at the Battle of Legnica, and Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohyj, all within the same remarkable campaigning season of 1241. European chroniclers, largely unfamiliar with steppe warfare, and genuinely terrified by reports reaching them from further east, struggled to explain Mongol tactical success, and European kingdoms braced for what seemed like an unstoppable, civilization-ending advance deep into the heart of Western Europe itself. Then, remarkably, the Mongol armies withdrew. The great Khan Ojdeh had died back in Mongolia, and Mongol succession customs required senior princes, including Batu himself, to return home for the Kurultai that would select the next great Khan. A political and dynastic requirement rather than any European military victory that likely saved much of Western Europe from a Mongol invasion. Many historians believe it was, at that specific military moment, simply not equipped to stop. Chapter 21. Möngke Khan and the Empire's Last Unity. Following Ojdeh's death and a period of regency and internal political maneuvering among Genghis Khan's descendants, Möngke, a grandson known for genuine administrative competence and personal military discipline, was elected Great Khan in 1251, ushering in what many historians consider the last period of genuinely unified Mongol imperial authority before the empire's later permanent fragmentation into separate khanates. Möngke launched two major, simultaneous campaigns during his relatively short reign, sending his brother Hulagu westward into Persia and the Middle East, leading eventually to the fall of Baghdad, while personally overseeing continued campaigns against Song Dynasty China in the east alongside his brother Kublai. A genuinely enormous, coordinated two-front strategy that reflected the Mongol Empire's continued, if increasingly strained, capacity for unified action across almost the entire breadth of Eurasia at once. Möngke's death in 1259, during his own personal campaign in China, triggered exactly the kind of succession crisis and required withdrawal that had already disrupted the European campaign decades earlier. This time, pulling Hulagu's forces back from their momentum in the Middle East and directly contributing to the weakened force that would soon suffer defeat at Ain Jalut. His death also sparked a direct succession dispute between his brothers Kublai and Eric Burke. A civil war within the ruling family itself that many historians mark as the moment the once genuinely unified Mongol Empire began its final, irreversible drift into the separate, increasingly independent khanates that would define its remaining history. Chapter 22: Baghdad and the Ending of a Golden Age. In 1258, Mongol forces under Genghis Khan, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, besieged and captured Baghdad, then the magnificent capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and one of the intellectual and cultural centers of the entire medieval world, home to the great library and scholarly tradition covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on the origin of money's discussion of Islamic Golden Age banking and credit. The sack of Baghdad proved catastrophic on a scale that shocked the wider medieval world. The city's renowned House of Wisdom and its vast libraries were destroyed, with later accounts, likely somewhat exaggerated, but reflecting genuine, severe damage, describing the Tigris River running black with ink from countless destroyed manuscripts and books thrown into the water. Historians still debate how much this event alone should be blamed for ending the broader Islamic Golden Age versus other longer-term political and economic pressures already affecting the region. But there's little debate that Baghdad's fall marked a genuine, sharp break in the city's status as one of the world's great centers of learning, one from which it would not fully recover for centuries. The last Abbasid caliph, Al-Mustasim, was executed following the city's fall, and Mongol tradition, which held that spilling royal blood directly was inappropriate, reportedly led to his execution by having him rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses rather than killed by blade or arrow. Whether this specific detail is entirely accurate or embellished by later chroniclers, it reflects a genuine, documented Mongol cultural practice of avoiding direct bloodshed when executing royalty, applied here to end over 5 centuries of unbroken Abbasid caliphal rule. Not every scholar and physician in Baghdad was killed during the sack, and Hulagu himself, despite the destruction, showed some interest in preserving certain scholarly and scientific work, reportedly sparing Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, a renowned Persian astronomer and mathematician, and later supporting his construction of a major new observatory at Möngke. A small, telling reminder that even amid the sack's genuine devastation, Mongol rulers' relationship with conquered scholarship and science remained more complicated and selectively preservationist than pure destruction alone would suggest. Chapter 23: Women of the Mongol Court. Mongol women held a notably active, visible role in political and economic life compared to women in many contemporary settled societies, particularly the Islamic and Chinese civilizations bordering the steppe. A difference numerous medieval travelers and chroniclers explicitly remarked on with evident surprise. Mongol women traditionally managed the family's jur, herds, and household finances, while men were away on campaign or the hunt, often for months or years at a time, developing genuine, independent authority over substantial household economic decisions as an ordinary, expected part of steppe life, rather than an unusual exception. Several Mongol women wielded direct political power at the highest levels. Sorgatani Biki, a daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan, managed her own son's education and political positioning so effectively after her husband's death that all 4 of her sons eventually held major positions of power, including Kublai Khan himself, with contemporary observers, including the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, praising her political acumen as exceeding that of most male rulers of her era. Temujin Khatun, widow of Ojde, served as regent and effectively ruled the entire Mongol Empire for several years following her husband's death, managing the complex politics of succession until a new great Khan could be formally selected. A position of enormous, if often less celebrated, authority that later, more male-focused historical accounts sometimes minimized or omitted entirely. Chapter 24: Kublai Khan and the Yuan Dynasty. Kublai Khan, another grandson of Genghis Khan, completed the conquest of Song Dynasty China and established the Yuan Dynasty in 1271, becoming the first non-Chinese emperor to rule the entirety of China, adopting many traditional Chinese administrative practices while maintaining distinct Mongol identity and privilege at the top of his new dynasty's social hierarchy. It was at Kublai Khan's court that Marco Polo, whose account of Chinese paper currency was covered in detail in an earlier comfy sleeping story on the origin of money, reportedly spent years in Mongol service, and his later written descriptions of the great Khan's wealth, sophistication, and enormous, well-governed empire introduced medieval Europe to a vision of the wider world far larger and more impressive than most Europeans had previously imagined possible. Kublai Khan's ambitions did have real limits, though. 2 large naval invasions of Japan in 1274 and again in 1281 both ended in catastrophic failure. The second, famously destroyed by a massive typhoon, the Japanese would later remember as kamikaze, the divine wind. A rare, clear instance of Mongol expansion meeting a natural and military obstacle it simply could not overcome. The scale of the second invasion fleet, assembled specifically to overwhelm Japanese defenses after the failure of the first attempt, was genuinely enormous by medieval standards, reportedly involving well over 4,000 ships and over 100,000 soldiers and sailors drawn from across the Mongol-ruled Chinese and Korean territories, making the typhoon's near-total destruction of this force one of the most consequential weather events in recorded military history, sparing Japan from what might otherwise have been a very different, Mongol-influenced future. Mongol naval and amphibious warfare, more broadly, never matched the overwhelming effectiveness of their land-based cavalry campaigns, reflecting a genuine, practical limit to how far the Mongols could successfully adapt their fundamentally horse and steppe-based military tradition into entirely unfamiliar operational environments. However successfully, they had adapted to siege warfare and administration in their earlier land campaigns. Chapter 25: Xanadu and the Poet Who Never Saw It. Kublai Khan's magnificent summer capital, Xanadu, situated in the grasslands north of Beijing and blending Mongol and Chinese architectural traditions, would go on to achieve a strange, lasting fame in a language and culture entirely removed from its own, through a poem written centuries later by a man who had never actually visited it. The English Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, reportedly inspired by reading an account of Marco Polo's travels and Kublai Khan's court, composed the famous poem Kublai Khan in the late 18th century, describing a stately pleasure dome decreed in Xanadu, an English rendering of Xandu's name that has since become a widely used byword in English for any place of extraordinary, almost impossible luxury and grandeur. Coleridge himself claimed the poem came to him in an opium-influenced dream, interrupted before completion by an unexpected visitor, leaving the poem permanently unfinished. Whatever the truth of that famous origin story, the poem cemented Xanadu's place in the English-speaking imagination as a symbol of exotic, almost unreal splendor, entirely disconnected from the poem's actual, considerably more grounded historical origins as a real Mongol imperial capital with genuine administrative buildings, hunting parks, and diplomatic functions. The real Xanadu, abandoned and gradually reduced to ruins following the Yuan dynasty's collapse, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the 21st century. Its excavated foundations now drawing visitors curious to see the genuine historical site behind a poem far more people have actually read than have ever visited the ruins themselves. Chapter 26: The Empire Begins to Fracture. By the time of Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the once unified Mongol Empire had already effectively split into 4 increasingly separate, semi-independent khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde ruling Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, the Ilkhanate governing Persia and the Middle East, and the Chagatai Khanate controlling Central Asia. Each khanate developed increasingly distinct cultural, religious, and political characters over subsequent generations, often adopting significant aspects of the local cultures they governed. The Ilkhanate's rulers, for instance, eventually converted to Islam, the dominant religion of the Persian and Middle Eastern territories they ruled, a development that would have seemed strikingly unlikely to Genghis Khan's original, more religiously mixed steppe followers generations earlier. The Ilkhanate, despite its origins in Baghdad's destruction, went on to become a genuine patron of Persian art, science, and historical scholarship, commissioning the Persian historian Rashid al-Din to compile the Jami al-Tawarik, or Compendium of Chronicles, an extraordinarily ambitious universal history covering Mongol, Persian, Chinese, Indian, and European history alike, illustrated with a genuinely innovative blending of Persian, Chinese, and Byzantine artistic styles, reflecting the empire's own vast, connected geographic reach. The Chagatai Khanate, controlling Central Asia, proved the least stable of the four successor states, fracturing repeatedly into smaller competing territories over the following century. Its own eventual western portion, providing the political and territorial foundation from which Timur would later rise to build his own separate conquering empire. Covered in more detail later in tonight's story. These four khanates increasingly competed and occasionally fought outright with one another over territory and succession disputes, undermining the very unity that had made the original Mongol conquests so overwhelmingly effective, and setting the stage for each khanate's eventual, separate decline over the following century or two. Chapter 27. Mongol Law and the Paiza Passport System Revisited. The Yasa Legal Code, briefly introduced earlier in tonight's story, governed far more than military discipline alone, extending into everyday civil and criminal matters across the empire's enormously diverse population. And its actual practical application, historians note, likely varied considerably from region to region, depending on local governors and existing legal traditions already in place before Mongol conquest. Mongol administrators generally proved pragmatic rather than rigidly ideological in how they governed conquered territories, frequently retaining existing local officials, tax systems, and legal customs wherever those systems already functioned reasonably well, reserving direct Mongol oversight primarily for military matters, major taxation, and ensuring continued loyalty, rather than attempting to impose a single, uniform Mongol administrative system across radically different conquered societies all at once. This pragmatic approach to governance, prioritizing effective results and continued revenue over cultural or administrative uniformity, likely explains a great deal about how such a relatively small founding population, the Mongols themselves numbering only in the hundreds of thousands at the empire's founding, managed to successfully govern, for a time, hundreds of millions of people spread across such an enormous and culturally varied territory, relying heavily on local expertise and existing administrative infrastructure, rather than attempting to replace it entirely with their own. Chapter 28. The Golden Horde's Long Shadow. The Golden Horde, ruling Russia and the surrounding steppe for well over 2 centuries, left a profound, lasting mark on Russian history and culture, extracting tribute from Russian principalities, while generally allowing local Russian princes to continue ruling their own territories under overall Mongol authority. This long period of what Russian historians traditionally call the Mongol yoke, shaped Russian political development in ways still debated by historians today, with some arguing it delayed Russia's cultural connection to Western Europe, while others emphasize how Russian princes, particularly the rising Principality of Moscow, learned valuable administrative and military lessons from their Mongol overlords that later princes would use, ironically, to eventually throw off Mongol control entirely. Moscow's rise to eventual dominance among Russian principalities was itself substantially assisted by its rulers' initial cooperation with the Golden Horde, collecting tribute on the Horde's behalf from other Russian territories, a role that gradually built Moscow's own wealth, administrative experience, and relative power compared to rival Russian cities, laying groundwork for Moscow's eventual leadership of a unified, independent Russian state. Russian liberation from Golden Horde authority didn't come through a single dramatic battle, but through a gradual, decades-long process of Moscow accumulating enough independent military and political strength to simply stop paying tribute and successfully resist the Horde's increasingly weakened attempts to reassert control. A process traditionally dated to the Great Standing on the Ugra River in 1480, where opposing Russian and Mongol forces faced each other across a river for weeks without ever actually fighting a decisive battle, before the Mongol force simply withdrew, marking, in retrospect, the quiet, undramatic end of over 2 centuries of Mongol authority over Russian lands. Chapter 29. Marco Polo's own uncertain legacy. The Venetian traveler, whose descriptions of Mongol China have appeared several times already in tonight's story, deserves a closer look himself, since his own account and its reliability has been debated by historians for centuries in ways that reveal a great deal about how difficult it can be to fully trust even a first-hand historical source. Marco Polo, traveling with his father and uncle, reportedly reached Kublai Khan's court in the 1270s and remained in Mongol service for some 17 years before finally returning to Venice, later dictating his famous account, The Travels of Marco Polo, to a fellow prisoner while held captive following a naval battle between Venice and a rival Italian city-state. Some historians have questioned whether Marco Polo actually traveled as extensively or held as prominent a position as he later claimed, noting curious omissions in his account, including no mention of the Great Wall, foot binding, or Chinese writing and printing. Details that seem surprising for someone claiming such extensive, direct experience of Mongol-ruled China. Other scholars argue these omissions reflect the specific circles Polo moved in and the particular interests of his intended European audience, rather than evidence of outright fabrication. Whatever the exact truth behind these ongoing scholarly debates, Marco Polo's account undeniably shaped European imagination and ambition toward Asia for centuries afterward, and its basic outline of Mongol wealth, sophistication, and vast territorial reach has been broadly confirmed by independent Chinese, Persian, and other historical sources describing the same Mongol court from entirely separate cultural perspectives, suggesting that even if some specific details remain uncertain or exaggerated, the essential picture he painted was substantially, genuinely accurate. Chapter 30: The Yuan Dynasty's Decline. Mongol rule in China under the Yuan dynasty faced growing difficulties across the 14th century, including natural disasters, plague outbreaks, and increasing resentment among the majority Chinese population toward what many increasingly viewed as foreign, extractive rule favoring Mongol and other non-Chinese elites over native Chinese officials and traditions. A series of rebellions, most significantly the Red Turban Rebellion, gradually eroded Yuan control across China through the 1350s and 60s, eventually leading to the Yuan dynasty's collapse and the rise of the native Chinese Ming dynasty in 1368, ending just under a century of Mongol rule over China. The Mongol elite retreated back to the Mongolian steppe following this collapse, in some ways returning to the same nomadic, tribal patterns of life their ancestors had lived before Genghis Khan's original unification. Though Mongol influence and periodic military threat toward China would continue in reduced form for centuries to come. The Ming dynasty that replaced Yuan rule in China deliberately positioned itself in official ideology and propaganda as a restoration of authentic native Chinese rule after a century of foreign occupation, even while quietly retaining a number of Yuan-era administrative practices and infrastructure that had, in practice, proven genuinely effective. A common pattern throughout history, where a new regime's political rhetoric of complete rejection often masks a more complicated, selective continuity underneath. Mongol raids and periodic military pressure against China's northern frontier continued for centuries after the Yuan collapse, prompting the Ming dynasty's own massive investment in fortification. Most famously, the extensive reconstruction and expansion of the Great Wall of China into something much closer to the extensive stone fortification system tourists recognize today, built specifically to guard against the renewed threat of exactly the kind of steppe cavalry warfare the Mongols had once used to conquer all of China outright. Chapter 31: The Battle of Ain Jalut. Not every Mongol advance succeeded, and one particular defeat in 1260 marked a genuine, significant turning point in the empire's seemingly unstoppable westward momentum. At Ain Jalut, in present-day Israel, Mongol forces under a general named Kitbuka were decisively defeated by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The first major battlefield defeat the Mongols had suffered in decades of continuous westward expansion. Several factors converged to produce this unusual outcome. The main Mongol army under Hulagu Khan had already withdrawn a significant portion of its forces eastward following the death of the great Khan Möngke, leaving a reduced force to face the Mamluks, who themselves were experienced, highly disciplined former slave soldiers, well accustomed to countering steppe-style cavalry tactics through their own extensive military training. The Mamluks also successfully used feigned retreat tactics, a maneuver the Mongols themselves had used to devastating effect against numerous less experienced opponents, turning one of the Mongols' own signature strategies back against them at a crucial moment in the battle. Ain Jalut's significance extended well beyond the immediate battlefield outcome. It demonstrated clearly, for the first time in the wider Islamic and Mediterranean world, that Mongol forces could indeed be defeated through disciplined, well-prepared conventional warfare, halting further Mongol expansion into Egypt and North Africa, and preserving Mamluk, and by extension, wider Islamic political control over the region for centuries afterward. Chapter 32. What the Mongol conquests actually cost. Modern historians and demographers have attempted, with real difficulty given the limitations of surviving records, to estimate the human cost of Mongol conquest across the 13th century, with some estimates suggesting tens of millions of deaths across the affected regions of Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe from direct violence, destroyed agricultural infrastructure, and resulting famine and disease. Some researchers have even suggested the sheer scale of population loss and resulting agricultural abandonment across the conquered regions may have measurably affected global climate patterns, as vast tracts of previously farmed land reverted to forest and absorbed additional carbon over the following decades. Though this particular claim remains debated and difficult to fully verify, given the limitations of both historical and climate data this far back. Contemporary chroniclers across the conquered regions, whether Persian, Chinese, Russian, or European, described the Mongol arrival in strikingly similar terms of shock and devastation. Regardless of their own cultures, very different prior experiences of warfare. The Persian historian Juvani, writing under Mongol rule itself, just decades after the conquest of his own homeland, described entire regions where, in his own words, one might travel for a great distance without encountering another living person. A level of documented devastation that modern historians treat as exaggerated in exact scale, but broadly reflective of genuine, severe demographic collapse across the hardest-hit regions. Whatever the precise numbers, there's little serious debate among historians that the Mongol conquests rank among the most destructive events in recorded human history. A genuinely brutal reality that sits, sometimes uncomfortably, alongside the era's simultaneous achievements in trade, connectivity, and administrative innovation, covered elsewhere in tonight's story. Modern historians generally caution against flattening this complexity into either a purely villainous or purely admiring narrative. The same campaigns that brought genuine devastation to Khwarazm and Baghdad also, within a generation or two, produced a period of trade, tolerance, and connectivity that many conquered regions hadn't experienced before, and wouldn't experience again for centuries after the empire's own eventual decline. Both realities are historically true at once. However uncomfortable, that combination remains to sit with fully. Chapter 33: The Black Death's Steppe Origins. The Mongol Empire's greatest unintended legacy may be one of history's deadliest disasters. A connection historians have pieced together carefully from surviving records across multiple affected regions. The Black Death, which would go on to kill an estimated third or more of Europe's entire population in the mid-14th century, is now widely believed by historians and epidemiologists to have originated in rodent populations in Central Asia, likely somewhere in or near the region encompassing modern Kyrgyzstan, before spreading outward along the same well-established trade routes. The Mongol peace had made safer and busier than ever before. One especially grim, well-documented episode illustrates this tragic connection directly. During a Mongol siege of the Genoese trading outpost of Kaffa on the Black Sea coast in 1346, plague broke out among the besieging Mongol forces, who reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, whether as a deliberate act of biological warfare or simply a practical means of disposing of their own dead. Accounts differ, and modern historians debate how decisive this specific incident actually was compared to normal trade route transmission happening simultaneously elsewhere. Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa are traditionally credited with carrying the plague back to Mediterranean Europe by ship, though modern research suggests the disease likely arrived in Europe through multiple separate routes around the same period, rather than this single dramatic episode alone. Either way, the underlying pattern remains historically significant. The same extensive, well-protected trade networks that had carried silk, spices, and diplomatic envoys safely across Mongol territory for over a century also proved tragically efficient at carrying a hidden, devastating passenger along with them. Chapter 34: What the Mongols actually built. Beyond conquest and destruction, the Mongol Empire left behind genuine, lasting administrative and technological legacies. The Mongols developed an extensive relay postal system called the Yam, with staffed stations at regular intervals, allowing messages and officials to move across enormous distances with a speed not matched again in the region for centuries. Mongol rule also facilitated significant technology transfer across Eurasia, moving printing techniques, gunpowder weapons, and various administrative and agricultural practices between China, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe, along the same trade and communication networks that had carried Mongol armies and Mongol tribute in the opposite direction only years or decades earlier. Agricultural knowledge and crops also moved along these same Mongol-protected routes, with certain crops, farming techniques, and even veterinary practices developed in one region, gradually spreading to distant, previously unconnected agricultural traditions elsewhere in Eurasia. A slower, less dramatic, but genuinely significant form of exchange, running quietly alongside the more famous movement of silk, spices, and gunpowder that tends to dominate popular accounts of this same connected Mongol-era world. Some historians argue that the Mongol Empire's disruptive, connective effect on medieval Eurasia, forcibly linking previously more isolated civilizations together, however violently, helped set longer-term historical processes in motion that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the age of European exploration, and the broader early modern world that followed the Mongol Empire's own eventual fragmentation and decline. Some historians have gone so far as to argue that European exploration itself, including Christopher Columbus's own voyages, was motivated in part by a desire to find a new route to the wealth and trade goods of Asia that Marco Polo and other travelers had described so vividly during the Pax Mongolica. After the later closure of the traditional overland, silk, road routes, following the Mongol Empire's own fragmentation made that older path considerably more dangerous and unpredictable again, meaning the Mongol Empire's rise and its eventual decline may both have indirectly shaped the very different, ocean-based world that followed it by outlining, and then closing off the alternative overland path many Europeans had once dreamed of instead. Chapter 35, Tamerlane's Second Steppe Storm. Roughly a century and a half after Genghis Khan's death, another conqueror rose from the same broader Central Asian steppe world, claiming descent from and deliberate inspiration by the earlier Mongol legacy, though he was Turkic Mongol by heritage rather than a direct descendant of Genghis Khan's own line. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, built a vast empire across Central Asia, Persia, and parts of the Middle East and South Asia in the late 14th century, employing tactics and organizational principles clearly influenced by Genghis Khan's own military legacy, while also cultivating his adopted capital of Samarkand into one of the era's great centers of art, architecture, and learning. Timur's campaigns are remembered, much like the original Mongol conquests, for a genuinely brutal combination of monumental cultural patronage, alongside extraordinary, deliberate violence against resistant populations, including reported pyramids of skulls left behind at some conquered cities as explicit warnings to others considering resistance. A chilling, direct echo of the psychological warfare tactics pioneered generations earlier during the original Mongol conquests. Timur's own empire, like Genghis Khan's before him, fractured relatively quickly after his death in 1405, though his descendants, the Timurids, continued ruling significant territories for generations, and one particular Timurid prince, Babur, would later travel south to found the Mughal Empire in India, carrying at least a distant echo of this same steppe conquest tradition forward into an entirely new region and century. Timur himself had actually been preparing an invasion of Ming China at the time of his death. A campaign that, had it gone forward and succeeded, might have reshaped East Asian history as dramatically as the original Mongol conquest of China under Kublai Khan generations earlier. His sudden death, while en route, ended that possibility before it could begin. One of history's genuinely significant near misses, dependent entirely on the timing of one aging conqueror's final illness. The Timurid dynasty that followed, despite its founder's brutal military reputation, went on to preside over a genuine cultural flowering in Samarkand and Herat, patronizing Persian miniature painting, architecture, and astronomy, including a major observatory built by Timur's own grandson Ulugh Beg, whose carefully compiled star catalog remained among the most accurate available anywhere in the world for roughly 2 centuries afterward. A reminder that the line between conqueror and cultural patron, already blurred throughout tonight's story, rarely stayed as clean in practice as it appears in simplified historical summary. Samarkand's Registan Square, developed substantially under Timurid patronage, remains today one of Central Asia's most celebrated architectural achievements. Its grand tiled facades and courtyards still drawing visitors and architectural historians alike. A lasting, peaceful monument built on wealth and territory, originally secured through campaigns, every bit as violent as those of the Mongol conquerors, who had inspired Timur's own rise a generation after Genghis Khan's own line, had already begun fracturing into separate, increasingly distinct khanates across the wider region. Chapter 36: What Remains. The Mongol Empire itself didn't last, in unified form, much more than a century or two before fracturing into separate, competing khanates, each eventually absorbed, conquered, or transformed by the very civilizations they had once ruled over. A strikingly fast rise and fall for the largest connected land empire the world has ever known. And yet its effects rippled forward for centuries afterward. Russia's eventual rise as a unified state, China's Ming and Qing dynasties defining themselves partly in reaction against Mongol-era rule, and Central Asian and Middle Eastern political boundaries and cultural patterns still bearing traces of Mongol-era disruption and reorganization. Echoes still faintly visible in the region today, nearly 800 years later. Perhaps that's the quietest lesson in tonight's story, that the fastest, most overwhelming rise in recorded history didn't guarantee the longest survival. Genghis Khan's empire changed the world permanently within a single century, and then, just as quickly by historical standards, quietly came apart, its pieces absorbed back into the very civilizations it had once so thoroughly conquered. Think back for a moment across everything that's passed through this story tonight. A hard, hungry childhood on an empty steppe. A boy who forgave his enemies and elevated them instead of killing them. A united nation born from countless rival, feuding tribes. Cities that fell in a single day, and empires that spanned continents within a single lifetime. Traders moving safely across thousands of miles under a single, if harsh, unified peace. And in the end, an empire that simply couldn't hold together any longer than the family bonds and shared purpose that had first built it. Modern Mongolia still honors Genghis Khan as its founding national figure, his image appearing on the country's currency, its largest airport bearing his name, and a colossal 50-meter stainless steel statue of him on horseback, now standing on the steppe itself, gazing east toward the very direction his conquests once carried outward, across nearly all of Asia and deep into Europe. For much of the 20th century, under Soviet-influenced Mongolian communist rule, Genghis Khan's memory was actually suppressed rather than celebrated, viewed as an uncomfortable symbol of feudal nationalism, inconvenient to the ruling ideology of the time. It was only after Mongolia's transition away from Soviet-aligned communism in the early 1990s that Genghis Khan's public memory and national celebration were fully restored. A reminder that even a nation's own relationship with its most famous historical figure can rise, fall, and rise again, not unlike the empire he once built. Whatever tomorrow holds can wait quietly until morning, the same patient way this whole long story has already unfolded tonight. One Khan, one campaign, one quiet century at a time. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. Let the horses and the Khans and the long, wide grassland fade quietly now. Let your thoughts loosen and drift and settle. If this story helped you rest, a like, a subscribe, or a follow, wherever you're listening, helps it find someone else who needs a little help falling asleep too. But that's a thought for tomorrow, not tonight. For now, just rest. Let go of the Khans and the conquests and the long, quiet centuries behind them. You're safe, you're comfortable, and there's nowhere else you need to be right now. Somewhere out on that same steppe tonight, the wind is still moving across the same open grass, exactly the way it did 800 years ago, indifferent to every empire that ever rose from it and every empire that ever fell back into it again. Let that image rest with you for a moment. Grass moving quietly under a wide, dark sky, exactly as it has for longer than any empire has ever managed to last, patient, unhurried, indifferent to every conqueror who ever rode across it, and still moving tonight, the same as it always has. Nothing more to carry forward tonight. No more names to remember, no more dates, no more distances crossed on horseback under an enormous, indifferent sky. Just this quiet room, exactly as it is right now, and the soft, settling dark, patient and unhurried, the same as that old grass has always been. Rest now slowly, the way the steppe itself always seems to move. Nothing urgent, nothing left to finish tonight. Only this soft, steady quiet, asking nothing of you at all. Let your breathing slow, gently, on its own. There's no more history to follow now, no more cons, no more distant horizons to cross. Just this quiet room, this quiet moment, and the soft, steady dark settling in around you. Sleep now. Drift all the way down. You've earned this rest, and it will still be here, waiting for as long as you need it. Good night, and sleep well.